In the last video of this series, we went over several pieces of evidence which infer the resurrection of Jesus. However, there is so much evidence we couldn't possibly fit it into one video. So I want to go over an additional, yet important piece of data that is often missed when evaluating the resurrection theory, and it is the origins of the Christian resurrection belief in comparison to the Jewish messianic expectations of resurrection and the Messiah from that time. N.T. Wright wrote a 740-page book called The Resurrection of the Son of God, asking the simple question, where did the resurrection beliefs of the Christians come from? The Christian belief of God and the Messiah was unlike anything from the ancient world. So the question arises, where could such a belief come from if this was all made up? The Christians believe, unlike their Jewish counterparts, that the Messiah was Jesus, who died and was physically resurrected. This was unlike anything Second Temple Jews were looking for, and expected the Messiah to be a conqueror who would break the rule of Rome and restore the kingdom of Israel. No one was looking for or thought God in the flesh would come as the Messiah to die and be physically resurrected in order to save us from our sins. Because of this, a lot of laymen try to claim this belief was borrowed from paganism. However, it is not supported by any New Testament scholarship, for the simple reason that pagans didn't believe it was possible to come back from death. From Homer to Plato, all ancient pagans knew one thing: death was a one-way street. Aeschylus said, "Once a man has died and the dust has soaked up his blood, there is no resurrection." Callimachus wrote a dialogue of someone asking a soul in Hades if there was a way out. "O Charideus, what of the world below? Much darkness. And what of an upward way? A lie." In the Iliad and Odyssey, the theme is pretty obvious. Once you are dead, you stay dead. When Priam mourns the death of her son Hector, Achilles tells her, "Lamenting for your son will do you no good at all. You will be dead yourself before you bring him back to life." Later in the Odyssey, Odysseus journeys to the underworld and engages with dead spirits, but even though they want to, none of them have any hope of returning from the underworld. As soon as a spirit leaves the white bones, and the ghost, like a dream, flutters off and is gone. The world of ancient pagans was pretty depressing. There was no return from death, just a hopeless existence as a wandering spirit in the underworld. Later on, there is a bit of hope in the works of Pindar, Plato, and Cicero, who argued although the body would die, the soul was immortal and would leave this world for a better spiritual existence. There was in fact a heaven the pagans could hope for, but it was not a bodily resurrection. In fact, a bodily resurrection was something that would have disappointed them, who hoped for liberation from the physical and to be transformed into a spiritual existence. As N.T. Wright says, neither in Plato nor in the major alternatives just mentioned do we find any suggestion that resurrection, the return to bodily life of the dead person, was either desirable or possible. One of the few tales of a return to bodily life in the ancient pagan world can be seen when Hercules rescues Alcestis from the underworld. But this can hardly be interpreted as what the Christians believed in, which was an eternal physical existence. Alcestis could only be classified as a resuscitation, which is brought back to a mortal existence, and it is expected they will die again. Whereas resurrection was more understood as coming back to life in a transformed, glorified body, and never dying again. And it was expected that Alcestis was only resuscitated, and would die like everyone else, and be trapped in the underworld eventually. Celsus and other pagan critics also dismissed these stories as impossible and mere fiction. Pagans did not take such stories seriously, nor make them their core doctrine. Resurrection and resuscitation were things to poke fun at, but not something they hoped for or thought was possible. And N.T. Wright addresses dozens of other pagan stories and authors in his book. Basically, you either followed Plato and didn't want a bodily resurrection, or you were a follower of the old ways in Homer and knew you would not get a body again. Even in Egypt, this was not something that was conceived to be possible. In Egypt, there was no eschatology, no apocalypse, no collective cataclysm, because there was no crisis. Death was life. In Egypt, death was just a continuation of life, not the end and the need for the hope of a bodily return. Death was just the next step of bodily life in the next world, but there was no return to this world. So like the rest of the pagan world, death was the end of the existence in this life, which is unlike what the Christians believed about their own future and what they had thought had already happened to Jesus. However, many laymen across the internet want to tell us Jesus was just copied off of pagan deities who were also physically resurrected. But this could not be further from the truth, and this is why scholars do not take these theories as credible. Many of these pagan deities were not human who were physically resurrected, but were metaphorically resurrected along with the crop cycles, or with the setting and the rising of the sun, like with Horus. Horus died every night, so to speak, and was resurrected in a sense when it rose. As N.T. Wright says, did any worshippers in these cults from Egypt to Norway at any time in antiquity think that actual human beings, having died, actually come back to life? Of course not. These multifarious and sophisticated cults enacted the god's death and resurrection as a metaphor, whose concrete referent was the cycle of seed time and harvest, of human reproduction and fertility. Stanley Porter says, bodily resurrection is not part of such cults and their beliefs. This pagan idea of gods dying and rising did not fit with the idea of how resurrection was actually defined in Christianity, that is, of a physical human body dying and coming back to life in a transformed, glorified body. This was in contrast to Second Temple Jews. While there was a variety of Jewish beliefs about the afterlife, ranging from those like Philo, who agreed with Plato that heaven would be in disembodied existence, to the Sadducees, who thought there was no afterlife at all, but that when we died, we simply rotted in the grave, and that was the end of our existence. But the majority of the Jews held to the Pharisaic idea that at the end of time, God would resurrect his saints into an eternal physical existence. Heaven would not be a disembodied existence, but a new heaven and a new earth with new glorified bodies. For the Christians, their belief that Jesus was resurrected was strictly Jewish in origin. It was the Jews who believed that at the end of time, God would resurrect all his children into an eternal bodily existence. However, Wright notes, the Christian belief mutated in several ways, and it is difficult to explain how this happened. First, the Christians made resurrection their central theme. There are many long Jewish works from around that era, which never mention resurrection. But for the Christians, this was their central theme that defined them. The early Christian movement fully centered around the idea that Jesus was resurrected, and their future hope rested in what he had done. As Paul said very early on, if there is no resurrection, your hope is in vain. There is no reason an early Jewish sect would feel the need to do this. Adding to that, the early Jews talked a little about resurrection, but they did not know what it would be like. Would it be shining like a star, as Daniel put it, or would it be a body exactly like the one we have now? But the early Christians moved from this debate to claiming they knew exactly what the resurrected body would be like, based on what they believed had happened to Jesus, and not what they had read from the Old Testament. For them, the resurrected body would be something transformed from the old material into a new incorruptible body with new properties. N.T. Wright notes that Christians like Paul or Matthew would constantly pull from the Old Testament to show Jesus was a fulfillment of the law. The Christians were constantly appealing to the Old Testament to support their case. But strangely enough, when they describe the resurrected body, there is a lack of appeals to the Old Testament description of the resurrected body. If the Christians were ransacking the Old Testament to try to make up a story of a resurrected Messiah, you would expect them to do that with the resurrected body as well, and paint the body of Jesus shining like a star, just like Daniel puts it. But instead, they described a body unlike what people were expecting, and provide no Old Testament support for it. The next mutation is the resurrection of the dead has become a two-stage process. They agreed with Pharisaic Judaism that the resurrection would happen to all God's people at the end of time, but they also said it happened to Jesus in advance. There is no reason any Jewish sect would make this claim. The only people to ever suggest a theory like this were in fact the Christians. Jewish saints who had previously died, like the Maccabean martyrs or early prophets, were said to have been vindicated by God and would be resurrected with all God's people at the end of time. But no one ever dared to claim this had already happened to them. If resurrection was just a way to describe how a martyr was vindicated by God, we would expect to see this of all saints who had died, like Moses up through John the Baptist. But we don't see any Jews applying this language. Nor do we see the Christians describing this to have happened to these other saints as well. Only the Christians said this only happened to one man who had died, Jesus of Nazareth. To claim such a thing would not only be incompatible with pagan beliefs, but also with Jewish expectations. To claim to Pharisaic Jews that one person had been resurrected in the middle of time would have been odd as saying that the Roman emperor was the Messiah. No one would have expected such an event to happen, and no one expected this to be about the Messiah. Which brings us to the most important mutation the Christians made. The Christians claim that Jesus was the Messiah specifically because of his resurrection. No Jews had expected this because no one had expected the Messiah would die, let alone a shameful, humiliating death by the Roman enemy. Yes, there are Old Testament texts that Christians appeal to support their case that the Messiah would die for the sins of mankind, but it is very clear no one had read them in that way until the Christians came onto the scene. The Jews expected the Messiah to be a conqueror who would free God's people from the yoke of Rome and establish an everlasting kingdom of Israel. The Messiah was to be like King David, not a poor man from Nazareth of all places, who was just a spiritual teacher and who the Jewish authorities turned over to the Romans to be shamefully mocked and executed like a criminal, all to die for our sins. The Second Temple Jews didn't believe or expect this to be necessary. Such a portrait of Jesus, for any Jew, should have dispelled any hope that he was the Messiah instantly, as so had happened with other supposed messiahs from around that time. What I mean to say is, we have evidence for several messianic movements from before and after the time of Jesus, and they all mostly end with the death of the alleged Messiah. And no one at that point thought their death meant they were indeed the Messiah. Quite the opposite. The death proved these men were definitely not the Messiah, and the movements that surrounded them disbanded once they had died. If your Messiah was killed, you either went back to normal life or you got yourself a new Messiah, as so was the case with every Messianic Jewish movement, except for the Christians. Had the Christians wanted a new Messiah, they had a likely candidate, James, the brother of Jesus. But even according to Josephus, no one ever called James the Messiah, but only the brother of the Lord. All the other Messianic movements from around that time are nothing like what we see in early Christianity. Yet modern skeptics wish to tell us that Christianity simply came out of this Jewish world through a little imagination. But N.T. Wright silences this with a little critical analysis, using what we know Jews of that time expected and thought about the Messiah.
Now this means that we can already rule out some very common suggestions. Many have proposed that the early disciples were so overwhelmed with grief at Jesus' death that they picked up the idea of resurrection from their surrounding culture and clung on to that. Maybe he's been raised from the dead, maybe, and then finally persuading themselves it was true, and then going out and telling people that it was true. Some have suggested that the earliest Christians believed that after his death, Jesus had been exalted to heaven, and then they gradually started to speak about resurrection because of that. Or that they had a sense that they had to carry on his mission to bring in God's kingdom, and that made them say he was raised from the dead. But would that make any sense? We can test it out with a little thought experiment. In AD 70, 40 years after Jesus' death, the Romans conquered Jerusalem and they led thousands of Jews captive back to Rome, including the man they regarded as the king of the Jews, the leader of the Jewish revolt, a man called Simon Bar Giora. Simon was led into Rome at the back of Titus's triumphal procession, and at the end of the spectacle, as everyone knew was going to happen, the king, the rebel king, the leader of the enemy, was flogged and executed. Now, supposing we imagine a few Jewish revolutionaries 3 days or 3 weeks afterwards. Somehow they've managed to escape being killed themselves and they're in hiding. And one says, I think Simon really was the Messiah, and I think he still is. And the others are puzzled. Of course he isn't. The Romans got him. They killed him. That's what they do to people. If you want a Messiah, you better find another one. Says the first, but I think he's been raised from the dead. What do you mean, his friends ask? He's dead and buried. Oh no, replies the first. I believe he's been exalted to heaven. The others look very puzzled. All the righteous martyrs, all those who have died for their faith, of course they're in heaven with God. Everybody knows that. The souls of the righteous are in the hands of God, and there shall no torment touch them. Famous Jewish text. That doesn't mean they've already been raised from the dead. It means they will be one day. Resurrection isn't something that happens to one person in the middle of history. No, replies the first, you don't understand. I've had a strong sense of God's love surrounding me. I've found God forgiving me for running away. I've felt my heart strangely warmed. What's more, last night I really thought that Simon was there with me. and the others interrupt and they're now angry. We can all have visions. Plenty of people dream about recently dead friends or family members. Sometimes that's very vivid. That doesn't mean they've been raised from the dead. It certainly doesn't mean that one of them is the Messiah. And if your heart has been warmed, then for goodness sake, sing a psalm. Don't make wild claims about a dead man. That is what they would have said to anyone offering the kind of statement which, according to the revisionists, the skeptics, somebody must have come up with at the beginning, as the beginning of the idea of Jesus' resurrection. But this solution isn't just incredible, it's historically impossible. Had anyone said any of those things that revisionists have suggested, some such conversation as I've just given you would have ensued. A little bit of disciplined historical imagination is all it takes to blow away enormous piles of so-called historical criticism.
Christianity is still an anomaly of history. Based on what we know about Jewish messianic expectations and movements from that era, it should have been easily predicted that upon the death of Jesus, his followers should have disbanded or found the new Messiah. But the exact opposite happened, which doesn't make any sense with Second Temple Judaism. From knowing everything we do about that time period, we would never have predicted such a movement should have formed. Something completely out of the ordinary would need to have happened, which transformed ordinary Jews from believing a Pharisaic view about the Messiah into a completely new, unexpected Christian view. What happened which caused such a historical anomaly? Looking at the theories we went over in the previous video, which attempt to explain this data, we have to realize the mythic theory has no hope of explaining this. We know the physical resurrection belief about the Messiah was not something Christians made up long after the disciples had passed away, because of the creed Paul preserves for us in 1 Corinthians 15, which is dated to within 3 years of Pentecost. This belief about Jesus was there from the start, as even Josephus records, and even if someone later on wanted to make up a story about a Jewish sage, reporting that he was physically resurrected was so misplaced from Jewish expectations and what the surrounding pagan world had hoped for. It would have made more sense for the pagans to paint Jesus like a second Socrates, a martyr of wisdom who had ascended to the spiritual realm, and by following his teachings, you can make it there too. Not that he was physically resurrected in space and time, and only through accepting him as Lord and true Emperor and King, you can be saved. A similar story would have happened if someone wished to convince the Jews. Just paint Jesus like another Old Testament prophet who was persecuted for his faith to God. But to declare him Messiah and that his kingdom on earth had already begun made no sense for the Jews who were still under Roman rule. Because of this, we also have to rule out the conspiracy theory for the same reasons. And also, if the Christians were simply making up a story to fool people into believing Jesus had resurrected, we would expect them to ransack the scriptures and report Jesus was shining like a star, just like Daniel says, instead of making up something no one was expecting. It would have been harder than today than if we declared Martin Luther King Jr. was a resurrected Messiah. Surely he was a great teacher and leader who was killed, but that doesn't mean he was raised from the dead, let alone a prophesied Messiah. The only way anyone would be convinced of this is if he appeared to them alive. And even if, against all odds, one managed to come up with this utterly misplaced idea and convince all the other remaining followers of Jesus, they would still have to justify the other facts we already went over, meaning they would have to steal the body, possibly induce group hallucinations to cover the other appearances, then take the light of their grave through persecution and torture. With the hallucination theory, as N.T. Wright went over, if someone thought they had a vision Jesus was vindicated by God and was in heaven, that would not mean he was physically raised, let alone the expected Messiah. It would have simply been dispelled as a vision, or the disciples would have taught Jesus was spiritually vindicated. But to be bodily raised was something so far out of Jewish expectations, no one would have ever hallucinated that someone could dream up such a story, let alone hallucinate that the event actually happened. As we went over in the previous video, for hallucinations to occur, there needs to be an expectation beforehand. If no one is expecting something, or doesn't have the idea already in their mind, no one is going to hallucinate it. So the hallucination theory is very improbable, given the background knowledge we know of the Jewish culture. No one wanted this to happen, simply because no one thought it was even possible. The only thing that could cause this radical new belief is something would have had to have happened, which could give the disciples a new perspective. New information would need to be introduced which could cause this new idea that radically transformed the world, and I don't see any other theory which can account for this besides the resurrection theory. From knowing everything we know about Second Temple Judaism, we would never have predicted such a belief would form unless that event actually happened. Combining this with our other pieces of evidence, we can see how other theories which attempt to explain what happened become very improbable in fitting the culture and data. The best theory that can fit all the data is still the one that was reported. The Christians preached Jesus was resurrected because that is what happened, and only that happening could convince them to believe it.